She had been showing up to his house every single morning for 7 years. 7 years. And he did not know she was dying. What would you do if you found out that the person who showed up for you every single day, who made your coffee, who kept your home running, who never once complained, was quietly dying, and never told you? Not because she forgot, not because she didn't trust you, but because she had looked at you long enough to know that you would never think to ask. That question is going to sit with you differently by the end of this story. I promise you that, because this is not a story about wealth. It is not a story about poverty. It is a story about what happens when a human being becomes so invisible to the people around them that they learn to carry everything. Every ounce of pain, every sleepless night, every fear, completely alone, in silence, with a smile, an oppressed uniform, and a 5 a.m. bus ride across a city that never once looked back at them. She was not looking for sympathy. She was not looking for recognition. She was looking for nothing because somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing she deserved to be seen at all. And the saddest part of this entire story is not what she was going through. The saddest part is that the man whose home she walked into every single morning had no idea. None. And he called himself a good person. Ask yourself this honestly. When was the last time you looked at the people who serve you, who clean for you, who show up quietly in the background of your life and actually saw them? Not their work. Not their function. Them. Because this story is going to make you think about that question in a way you were not prepared for today. And if you are the kind of person who thinks it could never be you, that you would never overlook someone that completely, I want you to stay with me. Because Raymond Smith thought the exact same thing. Right up until the moment he knocked on that door and the truth walked straight into his chest like something cold and irreversible. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to the beginning, because this story deserves to be told from the very start. And once you hear it, all of it, I do not think you are going to forget it for a very long time. Raymond Smith did not come from money. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, because it is the thing that explains almost everything else. He grew up on the south side of Atlanta in a house where the heat sometimes went out in January and dinner was whatever his mother could stretch. His father, James Smith, worked double shifts at a warehouse on the east side of the city for 31 years. 31 years of lifting and loading and coming home with a back that never fully recovered, for a paycheck that never fully covered everything it needed to cover. And his mother, Dorothy, cleaned other people's homes. She would wake before the sun came up, put on her uniform, and ride 2 buses to get to houses that were nothing like the one she lived in. Houses with heated floors and large refrigerators and children who left their toys scattered across rooms that were bigger than her entire apartment. She cleaned those houses with care, with pride, and she came home every evening smelling like other people's bleach. Raymond watched all of that. He watched it every single day of his childhood. And he made himself a promise so deep and so private that he never spoke it out loud to anyone. Not his mother, not his father, not his closest friend. He promised himself that he would never live the way they lived. Not because he was ashamed of them. He loved his parents with everything he had. But because he had watched 2 good, hardworking, decent people give everything they had to a life that gave them almost nothing back. And he decided, at 15 years old, standing in that kitchen watching his mother count change on the counter, that it was not going to be his story. He was going to build something real, something that lasted, and he was going to do it on his own terms. And he did. That is the remarkable thing about Raymond Smith. He actually did it. He put himself through community college working nights at a parking garage. He got his real estate license at 23. He made his first property investment at 27 with money he had saved for 4 years without touching. By 35, he had a small but growing portfolio of residential properties across Atlanta. By 45, he had a firm with 12 employees, commercial developments in 3 states, and a name that people in the industry recognized without needing a business card. He had built it all from the ground up, brick by brick, deal by deal, year by year. And there was not a single moment of it that had been handed to him. But here is what success did to Raymond Smith that he never saw coming. It made him efficient in a way that slowly bled into every corner of his life. In business, efficiency is a virtue. You move fast, you cut what does not work, you keep your eye on the outcome, and you do not let emotion slow the process down. Raymond was extraordinary at that. He was the kind of man who could walk into a failing project, assess it in 40 minutes, make 3 decisions, and turn it around in 60 days. His team admired him. His competitors respected him. His clients trusted him completely. But that same quality, that hard, clean, forward-moving efficiency, had quietly become the way he handled everything, including people, including grief, including himself. His wife Gloria died 4 years before this story begins. Breast cancer. She was 47 years old. They had been married for 19 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table, who laughed loudly and without apology and made every room she walked into feel warmer than it was before she arrived. When she was diagnosed, Raymond did what Raymond always did. He researched. He found the best oncologist in the country. He restructured his schedule entirely to be at every appointment. He managed the process with the same focus and precision he brought to everything else. And when she died, 18 months after the diagnosis, on a Tuesday morning in October with the window open and the sound of birds outside, Raymond sat beside her bed for 2 hours without moving. And then he stood up, called his assistant, and went back to work the following Monday. People thought he was strong. He was not strong. He was empty. There is a difference, and Raymond had never learned to tell the one from the other. Grief for Raymond Smith was not something you moved through. It was something you moved away from. You kept your eyes forward, you kept your schedule full, and you did not stop long enough to feel the full weight of what you had lost. Because Raymond had learned, somewhere in that South Side kitchen watching his parents strain under the weight of a life that was too hard, he had learned that stopping was dangerous. That if you stopped, something might catch up to you. So he never stopped. Not for Gloria. Not for himself. Not for anyone. And that is the man that Kathleen Davis walked into the life of 7 years ago. A man who was, by every external measure, extraordinary. And who was, by every internal one, completely alone. She arrived the first morning with a reference letter from her previous employer, a quiet confidence that did not ask for anyone's approval, and a professionalism that Raymond recognized and respected immediately. He told his assistant after the first week that Kathleen was excellent and that he did not want to have to think about the household again. And he didn't. That was the arrangement. She made it run. He did not have to think about it. He did not have to think about her. She arrived every weekday at 7 in the morning. She was never late. Not once in 7 years. She moved through that penthouse with a kind of careful grace, thorough, quiet, precise. She knew which coffee he preferred on which days. She knew that he liked the blinds at a specific angle in the afternoon. She knew, without being told, that the photograph of Gloria on the mantel was not to be moved under any circumstances. Only dusted gently with a soft cloth. She learned all of this not because Raymond told her, but because she paid attention. Because Kathleen Davis was the kind of person who paid attention to the world around her, even when the world around her was paying no attention at all to her. Raymond knew her name. He knew she was reliable. He knew she took her job seriously. And that was the full extent of what he knew about the woman who had been inside his home, 5 days a week, for 7 years. She was part of the routine, like the coffee maker, like the elevator, like the hum of the city outside his window. She was simply there. And like everything else Raymond Smith had stopped allowing himself to feel, he had stopped allowing himself to see her a very long time ago. But the morning Kathleen did not show up, that was the morning Raymond Smith's perfectly controlled life began to come apart at the seams. Started like every other morning. The alarm on Raymond's phone went off at exactly 6:30, the way it always did. He was already half awake before it sounded. He rarely slept deeply anymore, had not slept deeply in years, and he silenced it with one hand and lay there for a moment in the gray, early light of the penthouse, staring at the ceiling the way a man does when he is not quite ready to begin being himself again. Then he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the way he always did, and the day began its familiar machinery. Shower, dress, walk to the kitchen, And that is where the morning stopped being like every other morning. Because the kitchen was silent. The coffee was not made. The blinds were still closed. And the penthouse had that particular stillness to it that told him, before he had fully processed it, that no one else was there. He checked his watch. 7:15. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked around the room as if Kathleen might somehow be in a corner he had not looked at yet. She was not. He walked to the hallway. Nothing. He checked the laundry room. Empty. He came back to the kitchen and stood there with his hands in his pockets, feeling something he could not immediately name. It was not quite concern. It was not quite irritation. It was something quieter than both of those things. A small but insistent wrongness, the way you feel when a sound you have heard every day suddenly stops and the silence where it used to be is louder than the sound ever was. He picked up his phone and scrolled to find her number. And that was when the first thing happened that he was not prepared for. He did not have it. He scrolled through his contacts twice, slowly, and Kathleen Davis was not there. He had never saved her number. In 7 years, he had never had occasion to call her directly. Any scheduling or communication had gone through his assistant, and so her number had simply never made it into his phone. He stood there looking at the screen for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he opened his email and searched her name and found a thread from 7 years ago when she was first hired, and there it was at the bottom of an introductory message from his assistant. A phone number he had never once dialed. He called it. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. A brief, professional recording. Her voice, calm and measured, asking the caller to leave a message. He did not leave one. He hung up and called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. He set the phone face down on the counter and told himself she would call by 9. There was a reasonable explanation. A family matter. A medical appointment she had forgotten to mention. Something ordinary and easily resolved. He made his own coffee, badly, and sat at the kitchen island with his laptop and tried to focus on the emails that had come in overnight. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word of it. By 9 o'clock she had not called. He asked his assistant, Marcus, to pull whatever contact information existed in Kathleen's employment file. Marcus came back within 10 minutes. And what he reported stopped Raymond in a way that a business problem had not stopped him in a very long time. There was no emergency contact listed in her file. None. The space on the original employment form where an emergency contact name and number should have been written was blank. No family member. No friend. No neighbor. Just a name, a social security number, a start date, and a home address on the west side of Atlanta. That was all she had given them. And in 7 years, no one in Raymond's office had ever thought to follow up and ask for more. Raymond looked at that address on his screen for a long time. He told himself it was not his responsibility. She was an employee. Employees called when they were going to miss work, and when they did not call, the appropriate response was to note the absence and wait for contact, not to drive across the city like a worried relative. He had a 10 o'clock call with investors. He had a site visit at 1. He had a full day that did not have room in it for this. He closed the email and went back to his laptop and lasted approximately 4 minutes before he opened it again and looked at the address one more time. Noon came. No call. No text. Nothing. He ate lunch at his desk and checked his phone between bites more times than he would ever have admitted to anyone. 2 o'clock came and went. Then 3. Then 4. The investor call had happened and he had said the right things in the right order and not retained a single word of it. The site visit had been handled by his project manager. And through all of it, through every hour of that Tuesday, the wrongness that had started in his kitchen at 7:15 had not gone away. It had grown. Quietly and steadily, the way water rises in a room with no drain. You do not notice how high it has gotten until it is already at your chest. At 4:30, Raymond Smith picked up his car keys. His driver offered to take him. He said no. He did not entirely know why he said no, but he did. He got into his own car. A thing he did perhaps 3 times a year, and he pulled out of the parking garage beneath the building and pointed himself west. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Raymond Smith was driving somewhere with no plan, no agenda, and no certainty about what he would find when he got there. Atlanta's rush hour was already thickening on the expressway, and he sat in the slow crawl of it with his hands on the wheel and the radio off. He watched the skyline of the city rise and flatten in his rearview mirror as he moved further from the center of it. The neighborhoods changed around him gradually, the glass and steel giving way to older brick, the manicured medians giving way to cracked sidewalks and corner stores with hand-painted signs, the wide pristine streets giving way to narrower ones lined with row homes and chain-link fences and oak trees, whose roots had long ago buckled the pavement around them. This was still Atlanta, the same city he had lived in his entire life. But it was a part of it that Raymond moved through only in the abstract, as acreage, as zip codes, as market data on a spreadsheet. Not as streets. Not as homes. Not as the place where real people came home to at the end of the day. He turned onto her block at 5:10. It was quiet in the way that working-class neighborhoods get quiet in the early evening. Not empty but settled. A man washing a car in his driveway 2 houses down. Children on a front stoop across the street, laughing at something on a phone. A dog somewhere nearby, barking twice and then going silent. Raymond slowed the car and found the address and pulled to the curb in front of a narrow 2-story house with aluminum siding the color of old cream. It was modest, unassuming, but there was a small flower bed along the front path, pansies recently watered, planted in a careful row, and the front steps had been swept clean, and the windows were covered with simple white curtains that were perfectly even on both sides. Someone lived here who cared about the place. Someone who, even with whatever they were dealing with, had taken the time to tend to it. Raymond sat in the car for a moment. He felt, suddenly and acutely, how strange this was. How far outside the boundaries of anything he normally did. He was a man who operated within systems, within structures, within the clean lines of professional conduct and personal distance. And here he was, sitting outside his housekeeper's home at 5 in the evening like a man who did not know how to explain himself. He almost started the car again. He almost told himself that he had done enough, that he had come, that he could leave a note, that he could have Marcus follow up in the morning. He almost left. And if he had started that car and pulled away from that curb, this story would not exist. But he did not. He got out of the car, walked up the front path between the pansies, climbed the 2 front steps, and knocked on the door. Silence. He waited. Knocked again a little louder. Nothing moved behind the curtains. The evening air was cool and smelled faintly of someone cooking dinner a few houses away. Something with onions, something warm and familiar. He waited another 30 seconds and then stepped back, and he was just turning to go back down the steps when he heard it. A sound from somewhere inside the house, low and brief and then quickly swallowed back into silence. It might have been the television. It might have been the house settling. But it did not sound like either of those things. It sounded like a person trying very hard not to make a sound. And Raymond's hand, which had already reached for the railing to go back down the steps, went completely still. He stood there on that front porch in the cooling Atlanta evening, and he did not move. And he did not leave. Because something in that sound, something he could not have explained to anyone if he had tried, told him that whatever was on the other side of that door was something he needed to see. And what came next he was not ready for. The door opened slowly. And it was not Kathleen. It was a girl. 17, maybe 18, with her mother's same dark eyes and her mother's same careful posture. The kind of posture that does not come from privilege but from pride, from the decision, made somewhere early in life, to carry yourself with dignity regardless of what is happening around you. Her eyes were red and swollen in the way that eyes get when someone has been crying for a long time and has only recently stopped. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt and had her arms crossed loosely over her chest, and she looked at Raymond the way young people look at strangers who show up at their door uninvited, with a wariness that was not rude but was absolutely firm. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him and waited. Raymond introduced himself. He said his name. He said he was Kathleen's employer. He said he had been trying to reach her all day and that he had come to make sure everything was all right. He heard himself saying the words and was aware, even as he said them, of how insufficient they were, how thin and formal they sounded standing on the porch of this house in the cooling evening air. The girl, whose name was Eva, though Raymond did not know that yet, studied him for a long moment with an expression he could not fully read. It was not hostility. It was not relief. It was something more complicated than either of those things. It was the look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is trying to decide, in real time, whether the person standing in front of them is actually capable of understanding the weight of it. Then she stepped aside and let him in. The inside of the house was small. That was the first thing Raymond registered. The scale of it, the compactness of the rooms, the way the furniture had been arranged with precision to make the most of every inch of space. But it was immaculate. There was not a dish out of place, not a surface that had not been wiped clean, not a corner that had been neglected. Even in whatever crisis had descended on this household, someone had made sure the house was kept. And Raymond understood instinctively that it was Eva who had done that she had kept the house the way her mother had always kept it, because it was the one thing she could control, the one act of love available to her in a situation where she was otherwise helpless. He stepped through the narrow entryway and turned the corner into the living room. And then he stopped walking. He stopped completely, one foot still slightly raised, and he stood there and looked at what the living room had become. The sofa had been pushed against the far wall. The coffee table was gone. In the center of the room, where a family's living space should have been, there was a hospital bed, adjustable, with rails on both sides, and beside it an four-stand with a drip bag hanging from the hook, and a small rolling table with medication bottles arranged in a careful row, and a pulse oximeter clipped to the bed rail, and a baby monitor on the windowsill that was connected, Raymond realized, to something in the back of the house, so that Eva could hear her mother from any room. It was not a living room anymore. It was a sick room. A careful, clean, dignified sick room that someone had assembled piece by piece in the middle of their own home because there was no other option. And lying in the bed, on top of the covers, with a thin blanket pulled to her waist and her hands folded together on top of it, was Kathleen. She looked smaller than he remembered. That was the thought that came to Raymond first, and it came with a force that surprised him. She had always seemed to him like a woman who occupied space with quiet solidity. Present, capable, contained. But the woman lying in that bed looked diminished in a way that went beyond weight loss, beyond the pallor of her skin, beyond the tiredness around her eyes that was visible even in sleep. She looked like someone who had been spending energy she did not have for a very long time, and whose body had finally, in the privacy of her own home, allowed itself to show the truth of it. Her chest rose and fell in the slow, shallow rhythm of medicated sleep. She did not stir. She did not know he was there. Raymond stood at the edge of that room and did not speak for what felt like a very long time. Eva came and stood beside him, not close, but close enough. And then she began to talk, quietly, in a voice that was controlled in the way that voices get controlled when the person speaking has already cried everything out and is now operating on something past tears, something harder and more functional than grief. She told him that her mother had been diagnosed 11 months ago. A serious illness, the kind that required ongoing treatment, the kind that came with a list of things you were no longer supposed to do and a shorter list of things your body could still reliably manage. The kind that, in a different life with different resources, would have meant stopping work immediately and focusing entirely on getting better. But Kathleen had not stopped. She had gone to her appointments on Saturday mornings, on her day off, so that Raymond would not notice the schedule change. She had managed her medication around her work hours. She had worn long sleeves on the days when the treatment left marks on her arms. She had smiled at the door every morning and moved through that penthouse with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to the work. And she had said nothing. Not to Raymond. Not to his assistant. Not to anyone connected to that job. Because she needed every paycheck. Because Eva was in her senior year and college applications cost money, and the application fees alone had stretched the budget to its limit. Because the mortgage on this house, a house Kathleen had bought on her own after her husband passed, a house she had made payments on through every difficult year since, was not going to pay itself. And because Kathleen Davis had spent her entire adult life solving her own problems, and she was not about to start asking a man who had never once asked about her life to suddenly become part of it. Eva said all of this without drama, without performance. She said it the way her mother would have said it. Plainly, with precision, looking Raymond in the eye. And Raymond listened. He stood in that converted living room in his tailored wool coat, and he listened to the 17-year-old girl explain the architecture of her mother's quiet suffering. And he felt something happening in his chest that he did not have a clean word for. It was not pity. It was something older and more uncomfortable than pity. It was the slow, nauseating recognition of a man who is being shown, in full detail, the consequences of his own inattention. He thought about the mornings he had walked through the kitchen without looking up from his phone while Kathleen moved around him. He thought about the times he had left a list of instructions on the counter rather than speaking to her directly, because speaking directly would have taken 90 seconds he apparently did not have. He thought about the Christmas 2 years ago when he had meant to leave her an envelope with a bonus and had forgotten, and then forgotten again the following year, and had told himself he would make it up to her and never did. He thought about every morning she had arrived at his door in the dark of an Atlanta winter, having ridden a bus for over an hour, carrying whatever she was carrying in her body and her life, and she had walked in, and she had made his coffee, and she had begun her work, and he had never once, in 7 years, looked at her and asked how she was doing. Not once. He was still standing there, in the grip of all of that, when Eva shifted his attention to the wall above her mother's bed. He looked up, and that was when Raymond Smith saw the second thing in that house that he was not prepared for. Above Kathleen's bed, in the place where some people hang a cross or a clock or a mirror, there was a collage. It had been made carefully, the edges of each piece trimmed neatly, the arrangement deliberate and loving. Eva's report cards, going back years, each one bearing rows of excellent grades and handwritten teacher comments in the margins. Academic certificates. A ribbon from a regional science competition. A photograph of Eva in a cap and gown from her middle school graduation. Kathleen standing beside her with a smile so wide and so full that it looked like it could not be contained by the frame. And in the center of the collage, slightly larger than everything around it, in a clear plastic sleeve that had been put there to protect it, a letter. A single page on formal letterhead. Raymond's firm's letterhead. He took one step closer. He could see his own signature at the bottom. He knew his signature. He had signed thousands of documents in his life and he would have recognized it anywhere. But he could not, standing there in that room, remember signing this one. Eva told him, quietly, that 2 years ago her mother had prepared a scholarship recommendation letter for her. A prestigious academic scholarship for college-bound students in the Atlanta area, and had included it in Raymond's daily correspondence stack with a brief note explaining what it was and asking if he would sign it on Eva's behalf, as her mother's employer. Raymond had signed it the way he signed everything that came across his desk without requiring his direct attention, quickly without reading it. He had no memory of it whatsoever. That signature had helped Eva win the scholarship. And that scholarship, Eva said, had been the difference between them keeping this house and losing it. The year Kathleen's medical bills had begun. The year everything had become harder than it had ever been before. That scholarship, bearing Raymond's signature, had kept this family in their home. And he had not known. He had not known for 2 years. He might never have known at all. Raymond stood at the foot of Kathleen's bed and looked at his own signature on that wall, framed and protected and placed at the center of everything this woman loved most. And he felt, for the first time in a very long time, the full and undeniable weight of who he had been. Kathleen woke slowly. The way people wake when their body is using sleep as medicine rather than rest, coming back to consciousness in stages, reluctant, as though the distance between sleeping and waking cost something she was not sure she had enough of. Her eyes opened and she lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. And then something shifted in her peripheral vision, and she turned her head and saw Raymond Smith standing at the foot of her bed in his wool coat with his hands at his sides. And her whole face changed in a single second. What crossed Kathleen Davis's face in that moment was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was not even surprise exactly. It was shame. Swift and hot and immediately, fiercely contested by something stronger than itself. A pride so deeply rooted in her that it rose up instinctively, the way a person's hands come up to catch themselves when they fall. She had not chosen to feel ashamed. She would not have chosen it. But there it was, the unavoidable burn of being seen in a condition she had spent almost a year making sure no one connected to that penthouse would ever see her in. And then, just as quickly, her face composed itself. Her spine straightened against the pillow. Her hands, which had been resting loosely on the blanket, smoothed it down with a quiet deliberateness. And Kathleen Davis looked at the man standing at the foot of her hospital bed and became, as much as her body would allow, the version of herself she always brought to his door. She told him she was sorry for the inconvenience. Those were her first words to him. Not hello. Not how did you find me. Not what are you doing here. She apologized. She said she had not meant to leave him without coverage for the day, and that she would arrange for a substitute by tomorrow, and that she expected to be back herself by the following Monday. She said all of this in a voice that was steady and professional and cost her more than he would ever know to produce. She apologized to him, in her own home, from her sickbed, to the man who had forgotten her Christmas bonus 2 years running. And then she looked at him with an expression that made it absolutely clear that she was not looking for his sympathy, and was not going to accept his pity, and that she would prefer, if it was all the same to him, that they treat this as the minor logistical matter she was presenting it as. Raymond did not know what to do with that. He stood there and felt the full absurdity of his own position. A man of considerable power and resources, standing in someone's home uninvited, being apologized to by the person who should have been receiving an apology, and having absolutely no framework for how to respond to any of it. He asked after a moment what she needed. The words came out clumsier than he intended. Kathleen told him she was fine. She said it simply and without elaboration, the way people say it when they have been saying it for so long it has become its own kind of armor. Raymond looked at her, at the 4 line in her arm, at the medication on the rolling table, at the way her collarbone pressed against the neckline of her hospital gown in a way it had not pressed 6 months ago, and he knew it was not true. He knew it with a certainty that required no medical training and no particular insight. She was not fine. She had not been fine for a very long time. But he did not know how to say that without making it worse. He did not have the language for this. He was a man who had spent the better part of a decade building walls between himself and any situation that required him to be emotionally present. And now he was standing in a room that demanded exactly that, and he had nothing to offer it. So he said something inadequate, something about making sure she had what she needed, and Kathleen thanked him politely, the way she might thank him for a comment about the cleanliness of the kitchen counters. And he turned and walked back through the narrow hallway and out the front door and down the 2 steps between the pansies and back to his car. And he got in. And he sat there. He did not start the engine. He put both hands on the wheel and he sat in the dark of the early Atlanta evening, and he did not move for 20 minutes. The man 2 houses down had finished washing his car and gone inside. The children across the street had been called in for dinner. The street was quiet now and the lights were coming on in the windows of the houses around him, warm and amber, the ordinary light of ordinary evenings in ordinary lives. And Raymond Smith sat in his car outside Kathleen Davis's house and felt something he had not felt since the night Gloria's oncologist had first used the word terminal. It was not grief exactly. It was not guilt exactly. It was something that contained both of those things but was larger than either of them. A vast, pressing awareness that settled on him like a physical weight and would not be reasoned with and would not be managed and would not be moved by efficiency or forward motion or any of the tools he had spent 30 years perfecting. It was the weight of a man who has just been shown, clearly and without mercy, that he has been absent from his own life. Not absent in the way of a man who travels too much or works too late. Absent in a deeper way. Absent in the way of a man who decided, at some point he could no longer precisely identify, that the safest thing was to feel as little as possible and to see only what was directly relevant to his immediate objectives and to keep moving and to never, under any circumstances, stop long enough to look at the people around him and ask what they were actually carrying. He had done that with Gloria at the end. He had managed her illness the way he managed everything else, and he had been so focused on managing it that he had missed things. Moments, conversations, ordinary afternoons that she had probably needed him to simply be present for. And then she was gone, and those moments were gone with her, and there was nothing to be done about any of it. And now here was Kathleen. Not gone. Still here. Still alive in that house with her daughter and her medication and her scholarship collage and her pressed uniform hanging somewhere. Raymond was certain. Ready for Monday morning. Still here. Which meant that there was still something that could be done. He did not know exactly what. He did not have a plan. He was not, in this moment, operating from strategy or calculation. He was operating from something rawer and less familiar than that, from the place in a person that exists beneath all their carefully constructed habits and defenses, the place that knows, when it is confronted with the truth, what the right thing is. Raymond Smith sat in that car and listened to that place. And then he got out of the car, walked back up the front path between the pansies, climbed the 2 front steps, and knocked on the door again. Eva answered. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something that might, if he had earned it yet, have been the very beginning of relief. Raymond looked at her and said, without preamble and without any of the professional distance he had wrapped around himself his entire adult life. Tell me what she needs. All of it. Do not spare anything. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story. Because what happens next, what Raymond discovers about Kathleen that he was never supposed to know, is the part of the story that changes everything. And I promise you, you are not ready for it. Raymond went home that night and did not sleep. He lay in his penthouse with the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he stared at the ceiling, and he thought about Eva's face when she had listed the things her mother needed. The home nurse. The medication that the insurance did not fully cover. The follow-up treatments that had been delayed because delaying them was cheaper than scheduling them. He thought about all of it and he felt, for the first time in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with a project timeline or a profit margin. He knew what to do. He had resources. He had connections. He had a personal physician who owed him a favor and a network that could get things done quietly and quickly. This was, Raymond told himself as he finally drifted toward something close to sleep, the one situation in his life where his success could actually mean something to someone other than himself. He would fix it. He was good at fixing things. By the following morning he had already made 3 calls. His personal physician, Dr. Aldridge, agreed to coordinate a home care nurse. Someone qualified, someone consistent, someone who could be there on the days Kathleen needed support and absent on the days she needed privacy. Raymond covered the arrangement entirely, instructing his assistant to handle the billing through a discretionary account. He then called the billing department of the hospital where Kathleen had been receiving treatment and arranged to cover the outstanding balance on her account, as well as any future charges connected to her ongoing care. He did all of this efficiently and without fanfare. He told no one in his office what it was for. He did not call Kathleen. He did not send a note. He wanted it to simply be handled. Quietly and completely the way he handled everything. He thought he was doing the right thing. He was wrong. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Raymond was in the middle of a conference call when his cell phone buzzed with a text message from Eva. He stepped out of the conference call and called her back immediately. She answered on the second ring, and he could tell from the texture of her silence before she spoke that whatever she was about to say was not easy for her. She told him her mother had found out. About the nurse. About the hospital bills. And she delivered Kathleen's message with faithful precision. Kathleen wanted him to stop. She wanted the nurse cancelled and the hospital arrangement reversed. She had not asked for his help. She had not asked for his money. She had not asked for anything from him at any point in 7 years, and she was not asking now. She understood that he meant well, but she needed him to hear her clearly. She was not a charity case. She was not a burden he needed to lift, and she was not going to allow her medical care to become something she owed a man who had signed her paychecks. Those were her words, Eva said. Raymond stood in the hallway outside the conference room with his phone pressed to his ear and said nothing for a moment. He was stunned. In his mind, the calculation had been simple and clean. There was a problem. He had the means to solve it. He had solved it. That was supposed to be the end of the equation. The idea that the solution itself could be the problem had not entered his thinking at all. What Raymond Smith did not understand yet, what he had genuinely never had to understand, because his entire life had been lived on the side of the equation where you are the one offering help rather than the one receiving it, was that there is a particular kind of pain that comes from being helped by someone who never saw you until they needed to feel better about themselves. It is a pain that has nothing to do with ingratitude and everything to do with dignity. Kathleen Davis had spent 7 years being invisible to this man. And now, suddenly, because he had stumbled into her living room by accident, he had appointed himself her rescuer. Without asking. Without being invited. Without stopping to consider what it might feel like, from her side of it, to have the man who forgot your Christmas bonus twice now paying your hospital bills like it was a line item on his quarterly budget. Eva, for her part, was caught squarely in the middle of all of it. She understood her mother. She had grown up watching Kathleen solve every problem that came at them with her own 2 hands and her own quiet determination. And she knew that pride was not vanity for her mother. It was survival. But Eva was also 17 years old, and she was watching her mother get thinner and more tired, and she was lying awake at night listening for the sound of the baby monitor, and she was terrified in the specific, helpless way that children are terrified when the parent who has always been the strong one is no longer entirely strong. She did not have the luxury of principle right now. She needed her mother to get better. So she kept talking to Raymond. Carefully, reluctantly. She called him on a Tuesday evening, almost a week after delivering her mother's message, and over the course of that phone call, and the ones that followed, Eva began to tell him things about her mother's life that Raymond had never known and had never thought to ask. She told him about the bus. The 5 a.m. bus that Kathleen had ridden to his building every weekday morning for 7 years, a route that required one transfer and took just over an hour each way, meaning that Kathleen was leaving the house before the sun came up and arriving home in the early afternoon, and then on the evenings she worked her second job, leaving again. Raymond had not known about the second job. He absorbed that information in silence. Kathleen had been working weekends at a dry cleaning business 3 miles away, pressing and packaging other people's clothes, on her feet for 6-hour shifts. Since Eva was in middle school, she had never mentioned it. There had been no reason, in Kathleen's mind, to mention it to the man she worked for on weekdays. Eva told him about the budget. The spreadsheet her mother kept on a yellow legal pad. Not a computer, a legal pad, where every dollar of every paycheck was allocated before it arrived. Rent, utilities, groceries, Eva's school expenses. The small amount set aside each month toward Eva's college fund, which had been started when Eva was in 3rd grade and contributed to without interruption through every financial difficulty since. And then Eva told him about the uniform, about how every evening, no matter how tired she was, no matter what the day had cost her, Kathleen would take her work uniform and iron it. Every pleat, every seam, every button. So that when she walked through Raymond's front door the next morning, she would look like a woman who had not just ridden an hour on a city bus. Like a woman who deserved to be there. Raymond was driving while they talked, and when Eva said that he pulled over to the side of the road without planning to, he just pulled over. And he sat there with the engine running and the city moving past his windows, and he did not speak for a long time. And then Eva told him something else. Something that made the silence in that car go from heavy to absolute. Something that, when he heard it, made him understand that this story was not the story he had thought it was. Eva did not lead with it. She circled around it the way you circle around something when you are not entirely sure you have the right to say it, when the thing you are about to share belongs in some important sense to someone else. She had been talking to Raymond for almost 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of her mother's bed in the quiet of that converted living room while Kathleen slept, keeping her voice low and her words measured. And then she stopped. There was a pause in the conversation that felt different from the other pauses. Heavier, more deliberate, and Raymond, who was still parked on the side of the road where her last revelation had left him, waited without pushing. He was learning, in these conversations with Eva, that pushing was the wrong instinct. That the right thing to do was to be still and let the truth arrive at its own pace. Eva said she needed to tell him something. She said her mother would probably be angry if she knew she was sharing it. She said she had gone back and forth about whether to say it at all. And then she said it, not all at once but piece by piece. 6 years ago, she said, her mother had been approached about a different position. A family in Buckhead, one of Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhoods, had reached out through a domestic staffing agency that Kathleen was registered with. They were looking for a full-time housekeeper and household manager. The position came with full health benefits, paid time off, a salary that was significantly higher than what Raymond's firm was paying, not marginally higher but enough to have changed things. Enough to have meant that the second job on weekends would not have been necessary. Enough to have meant that the budget spreadsheet on the yellow legal pad would have had more breathing room in it. The hours were better. The commute was shorter. By every practical and financial measure, Eva said, it was a better situation. It was the kind of offer that, when you are a single mother working 2 jobs and riding the bus before sunrise, you do not walk away from without an exceptionally good reason. Kathleen had turned it down. Raymond asked why. He asked it quietly, in the way of a man who is beginning to understand that the answer is going to cost him something but needs to hear it anyway. Eva was quiet for a moment, and then she said, she told me you had just lost your wife, and she said you looked like a man who did not know how to be alone. The silence that followed that sentence was total. Raymond did not speak. Eva did not try to elaborate or explain or soften what she had just said. She simply let it exist in the space between them. This thing her mother had carried for 6 years without telling anyone. This quiet and uncelebrated decision that had been made on his behalf without his knowledge and without any expectation of acknowledgement or return. Kathleen Davis had looked at Raymond Smith, and she had seen something that he had not been able to see in himself. She had seen a man who was alone in a way that was going to hollow him out completely if nothing stayed consistent around him. And she had decided, without being asked and without any fanfare whatsoever, to be the consistent thing. Not because she was a saint. Not because she had some grand plan. Not because she expected it to mean anything to him or to anyone else. But because she was the kind of person who noticed. Who paid attention to the human beings around her even when those human beings were not paying any attention to her. Who understood, perhaps from her own experience of loss. Her husband had died when Eva was 9, and Kathleen had navigated that grief while keeping a household running and a child from feeling the full weight of it. That grief makes people into islands. And that sometimes the most important thing another person can do for an island is simply keep showing up on its shore. She had never told him. Not once in 6 years had she referenced the other offer or the choice she had made or the reason behind it. She had simply continued to arrive every morning at 7, to move through his home with her quiet efficiency, to do the work and leave and come back again. She had not done it looking for recognition. She had done it because it was what she believed was right. And then she had kept that belief entirely to herself for 6 years while she rode the bus and ironed her uniform and worked weekends and got sick and kept coming. Raymond thought about every morning she had moved through his home like she was trying not to take up space. He thought about the evenings he had come home late to find a covered plate on the kitchen counter. A meal she had prepared and left for him without being asked, without it being any part of her job description. He had eaten those meals standing at the counter and had thought, when he thought about it at all, that it was simply part of the service. It had not once occurred to him to ask himself why she did it. He thought about the afternoon he had come home to find Gloria's photographs on the mantel freshly dusted and straightened. The frames that had gone slightly crooked and accumulated a thin film of dust over the months since Gloria had been the one to tend to them. Kathleen had straightened them, had cleaned them carefully, had put them back exactly as they had been, as though she understood that those photographs existed in a precise emotional geography that was not hers to rearrange. He had barely registered it at the time. Now, sitting on the side of a road in Atlanta with the phone pressed to his ear, it was the only thing he could see. He thought about what it meant that this woman, who had every practical reason to take a better offer and no practical reason to stay, had looked at him and seen something worth staying for. Something he had not been able to see in himself. What kind of person does that? What quality of character, what depth of quiet human decency produces that kind of decision? Raymond had spent his entire career evaluating people. He prided himself on reading character quickly and accurately. And in 7 years, in thousands of ordinary mornings, he had completely failed to read the person who was closest to his daily life. He had looked at Kathleen Davis every single day for 7 years and seen a housekeeper. He had not seen a human being of extraordinary and private integrity who had made a sacrifice on his behalf that he did not deserve and had never been told about. The narrator will not make Kathleen into a figure of mythology here. She was not a saint. She was a woman, complex, proud, imperfect in the ways that all people are imperfect, with her own fears and her own stubbornness and her own blind spots. She was not simple. She was not symbolic. She was a full and specific human being who had lived a full and specific life, most of it invisible to the people who moved through it. And that invisibility, that chronic, unremarkable, socially sanctioned invisibility, was the thing that Raymond was only now, at 52 years old, beginning to understand the true cost of. Understanding what Kathleen had done was only half of what he had to reckon with. The harder question, the one that was going to keep him awake for the third night in a row, was what he was going to do about it. And whether anything he could do at this point was going to be enough. He called Eva the next morning and asked if he could come by. Not to arrange anything. Not to fix anything. Not to show up with solutions or resources or any of the machinery of his professional life. He just asked if he could come. Eva was quiet for a moment and then said she would ask her mother. He waited. 3 minutes passed. Then Eva came back on the line and said yes. Come at 2 o'clock. And that was all. Raymond arrived at exactly 2. He had driven himself again. He had not told his assistant where he was going. He had not brought anything with him. No envelope, no paperwork, nothing that could be interpreted as a transaction. He walked up the front path between the pansies and knocked on the door, and Eva let him in and led him to the living room without saying much. And there was Kathleen. She was sitting up. Not in the hospital bed this time, but in the armchair beside it, the one Eva had clearly positioned there for exactly this kind of moment, for the days when her mother had enough strength to sit upright and needed to feel like a person in a chair rather than a patient in a bed. She was dressed, not in her work uniform, but in her own clothes, a dark blue cardigan over a collared shirt, neat and deliberate. Her hair was done. It had cost her something to do all of that, Raymond could tell, the slight deliberateness of her posture, the way she held herself just a degree more carefully than she probably needed to, but she had done it anyway. Because Kathleen Davis was not going to receive this man, whatever he had come to say, looking like anything less than herself. She was thinner than he had registered the first time. The cardigan made it visible in a way the blanket had concealed, the narrowness of her wrists, the way the collar sat slightly looser than it was designed to. But her eyes were clear and steady and fully present, and when Raymond came into the room and she looked at him, it was the look of a woman who had already decided what she was, and was not willing to accept from this conversation, and was simply waiting to see which direction it went. Eva brought 2 glasses of water and then disappeared quietly to another part of the house. Raymond sat down in the chair across from Kathleen. Not beside her, not looming over her, but across from her, at the same level, in the configuration of 2 people who are about to talk to each other as equals. He set his hands on his knees. He did not open with small talk. He did not ask how she was feeling. He had rehearsed nothing. He had decided, on the drive over, that the only way to do this was to say exactly what was true and to say it without dressing it up in anything that made it easier for him to deliver. He told her he had not come to help her. He said it first, before anything else, because he needed her to know that this was not another attempt to manage her situation from a comfortable distance. He had not come with a plan or a solution or a check. He had come because there were things he needed to say that he should have said years ago and had not, and he was not willing to let more time pass without saying them. He was there to apologize. That was all. She could do with the apology whatever she chose. But he was going to give it to her honestly and completely, and he was not going to ask her for anything in return. And then he talked. Raymond Smith, who had built a career on knowing exactly what to say and exactly how to say it, who had never once walked into a room without knowing his objective and his exit, talked in the halting and imprecise way of a man who was not performing honesty but actually attempting it. He told her that he had spent 7 years treating her like she was part of the inventory of his life, like she was a fixture, something that maintained the function of the space but did not require attention beyond the basics of its upkeep. He said he knew that was not an acceptable way to treat another human being, and that knowing it now did not undo the 7 years of it, but he needed her to know that he knew it. He told her about the scholarship letter, that he had held it in his hands and signed it and set it back down without reading a single word of it, that he had looked at his own signature on that wall above her bed and had not been able to remember the moment he made it, that a document which had altered the course of her daughter's life had passed through his hands as casually as a catering invoice. He said that was not professionalism. He said that was negligence of a kind that had nothing to do with the office and everything to do with who he had allowed himself to become. He told her about Gloria. He had not planned to tell her about Gloria, but it came out of him in the way that things come out when you have finally stopped managing the conversation and are just inside it. He told her that when Gloria died he had made a decision, not a conscious one but a decision nonetheless, to keep moving. To never stop long enough to feel the full weight of what her absence meant. That he had gotten so good at moving that he had stopped seeing anything that was not directly in front of him and directly relevant to whatever he was moving toward. That he had turned his grief into a kind of tunnel vision that let him function and build and achieve and feel absolutely nothing of any real depth for 4 consecutive years. That the penthouse she walked into every morning was not a home. It was a very expensive, very well-maintained structure in which a man was hiding from himself. And she had been inside it every day. and he had never once let her see any of that. He stopped. The room was very quiet, and then he said the last part plainly, without any rhetorical architecture around it. He said that the most human presence in his home for 7 years had been hers, that she had been the only consistent, living, caring element in a space that had otherwise been completely empty of all of those things, and that he had wasted every single day of it. Every single one. Not because he meant to, but because he had not been paying attention, and not paying attention, he now understood, was its own kind of choice. Kathleen listened to all of it. She sat in her armchair with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened the way she did everything. Completely, without interruption, without performance. She did not cry. She did not reach out. She did not tell him it was all right, because it was not entirely all right, and she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she spoke. She told him she appreciated what he had said. And then she corrected him. Gently but clearly, in the way that a person corrects a narrative that has been built around them without their input. She told him she had not stayed at that job out of pity for him. She wanted that to be clear. She had stayed because the job was steady and the pay was reliable, and reliability, when you are raising a child alone, is not a small thing. She had made a practical decision that happened to be informed by her observation of his situation, and she needed him to understand the difference between that and self-sacrifice. She was not a martyr. And she was not, she said, without cruelty but with complete seriousness, his redemption story. She was a woman who had lived her own life, made her own decisions, and carried her own weight. What had happened between them, or rather what had not happened, all the years of his not seeing her, that was his to carry. She was not going to carry it for him. She had enough of her own. Raymond nodded. He did not argue with any of it. He simply listened and received the correction and sat with it. And the room was quiet again. Outside, a car went past slowly. A dog barked once and went quiet. The curtains moved slightly in a draft from somewhere in the old house. And then, after a silence that had gone on long enough to mean something, Kathleen looked at him. And something in her face. Not a softening exactly, not a surrendering of any of the ground she had just held, but something shifted. Some small, careful door that she had kept closed opened just a fraction. And she said it quietly. So quietly that if the room had been any less still, he might not have caught it. She said, "I did hope you would be all right. Eventually." That was all. 6 words. Said in the even, understated tone of a woman who had just admitted something she had kept entirely to herself for 6 years. Not a declaration. Not a confession. Just a quiet, true thing, offered plainly, the way Kathleen Davis offered everything, without expectation and without the need for it to be received in any particular way. Raymond Smith heard it. He heard it completely, and something happened in him that he had not felt in 4 years. His throat closed around something that rose from a place in him he had sealed off so thoroughly, he had half convinced himself it no longer existed. He did not make a sound. He did not move from his chair. But inside Raymond Smith, in the locked and carefully managed interior of a man who had not cried since the day they buried Gloria, something gave way. Something old and heavy and long overdue. And the woman sitting across from him, who noticed everything, who had always noticed everything, looked at his face and saw it happen. And she said nothing, because she understood, the way she had always understood the things about him that he had never said out loud, that this was not a moment that needed words. It just needed someone to stay in the room. And Kathleen Davis had always been very good at that. Raymond left Kathleen's house that afternoon without making a single promise. He had learned enough, in the past 2 weeks, to understand that promises made in the heat of an emotional moment were not the currency Kathleen Davis traded in. She did not want his feelings. She did not want his guilt transformed into grand gestures that made him feel better and left her owing something she had never asked for. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, what she had structured her entire life around, was respect. And respect, Raymond was beginning to understand, looked very different from what he had been offering. He called her 3 days later. Not Eva. Kathleen directly, on the number he had finally saved properly in his phone. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice steady and unhurried, and he asked her, simply and without preamble, what she needed. Not what he thought she needed. Not what made sense to him from the outside looking in. What she needed. He told her he was asking because he wanted to get it right this time. And then he stopped talking and he waited and he listened. Kathleen was quiet for a moment. And then she told him. She did not dress it up or minimize it or apologize for the asking of it. She said it plainly, the way two people talk when they have finally agreed to be honest with each other. She said she needed her medical bills covered. All of them, past and ongoing, without conditions attached and without the arrangement being subject to revision based on his feelings about it on any given day. She said she needed Eva's college education secured. Not promised. Secured. In writing. In a form that did not depend on Raymond Smith's continued goodwill or continued health or continued ownership of his firm. And she said she needed to return to work on her own timeline, when her body was ready, not when his schedule was inconvenient, with no reduction in her responsibilities and no one hovering over her shoulder to assess whether she was capable of doing the job she had been doing without complaint for 7 years. Raymond said yes to all of it. And then Kathleen said the thing that surprised him most. She said she wanted it formalized. Not as a personal arrangement between an employer and his housekeeper. Not as a favor that lived in the informal space between a handshake and a phone call. She wanted it structured through his firm's employee benefit system. Proper documentation, proper classification, everything above board and on record so that what she was receiving was her earned right as a long-term employee and not his charity dressed up in paperwork. She wanted a benefit structure that would have covered these things regardless. She wanted it done correctly, for her and for anyone else who worked for him and had been working without the protections they should have had from the beginning. She made him do it correctly, because Kathleen Davis had never taken anything she had not earned. And she was not about to start now. Not at 43 years old. Not from a hospital bed. Not from a man who had needed to stumble into her living room by accident before he thought to look at her. If Raymond Smith was going to help her, he was going to help her in a way she could stand behind. In a way that did not require her to be grateful in any direction she had not chosen. In a way that left her dignity exactly where she had always kept it, intact and entirely her own. Raymond took the following week to work with his attorney and his human resources director to establish a formal employee benefit structure for all household and support staff employed through his firm. Comprehensive health coverage, paid medical leave, and education assistance provision that could be applied to dependents of long-term employees. He did not announce it. He did not send a press release or post about it or mention it to anyone in his professional circle as evidence of his character. He simply had it done, reviewed the documents himself more carefully than he had reviewed anything in recent memory, and sent the finalized paperwork to Kathleen through proper channels. She reviewed it. She had her own questions, which she submitted in writing, with a precision that made his attorney comment that she had clearly read every word. Raymond said yes, she had, and that he should have expected nothing less. Eva's college costs were secured through the education provision, formalized, documented, and structured so that it existed independently of any personal relationship between Raymond and the Davis family. Kathleen received the paperwork and called Raymond to confirm she had received it and that it was satisfactory. She said thank you in the same tone she used for everything, measured, genuine, and not 1 degree warmer than it needed to be. Raymond said she was welcome in the same tone. And that was how it was between them now, not cold but not performed. Real. Which was, for both of them, something entirely new. Kathleen began her recovery in earnest once the financial pressure lifted. It is impossible to overstate how much of an illness is made worse by the weight of financial fear, the way anxiety and stress feed into the body's inability to heal, the way a person cannot rest completely when rest itself feels like a luxury they cannot afford. With the bills managed and Eva's future secured and the job waiting for her on her own terms, Kathleen's body finally had the conditions it needed to begin doing what it had been trying to do for months. She worked with her medical team without the scheduling compromises she had been making before. She rested without guilt. She let Eva take care of her in the evenings without redirecting her back to her homework every 5 minutes. Recovery is not a dramatic event. It is a slow, unglamorous, daily process of the body reasserting itself. But it began. Really began. And Eva, who had been lying awake listening to the baby monitor for months, started sleeping through the night again. Raymond, for his part, did not suddenly become a different man. That is not how people work, and this story is not going to pretend otherwise. He was still precise, still efficient, still more comfortable with systems than with feelings. He did not become warm in the way that some people are naturally warm, open and easy and quick to reach out. That was not who he was, and it was not going to become who he was at 52. But something in him had shifted in a way that was durable, the way shifts are durable when they come not from a decision but from an understanding. He started noticing. Not just Kathleen, though he noticed Kathleen in a way he had never permitted himself to before, but the people around him generally. His driver, who had worked for him for 9 years and whose daughter had recently started college. The woman at the front desk of his building, who had been there every morning for 6 years and whose name he had learned properly only 3 weeks ago. The team members in his office who stayed late and said nothing about it. He started noticing. It was not a grand transformation. It was something quieter and more sustainable than that. It was a man learning, at 52, to look up from his own life long enough to see the lives happening around it. He and Kathleen did not become friends in the conventional sense of the word. Their relationship did not transform into something that belonged in a different kind of story, easier, warmer, tidier at the edges. What it became was something more durable than friendship and more honest than the professional arrangement it had started as. It became two people who occupied the same space with full awareness of each other, who said good morning and meant it, who occasionally, when the morning was quiet and the coffee was made and there was a moment before the day began its machinery, exchanged a few words about something real. Not about the schedule or the shopping list or the condition of the granite counters. Something real. It was not much measured against 7 wasted years. But it was genuine. And genuine, Raymond was learning, was worth more than he had previously understood. And then there was the one final thing he did. The thing that nobody knew about. The thing that he had not planned and had not announced and had not done for any audience other than himself. It was small. It took perhaps 20 minutes of his time and cost him nothing beyond the price of a frame. But it might, in the end, have been the most important thing of all. He went to the file that his assistant had pulled from the archive, the old correspondence file from 2 years ago, containing the original copy of Eva's scholarship recommendation letter. He had the letter copied and he took it to a framing shop on the way home from the office one evening, and he had it mounted and framed simply. Nothing elaborate, just clean glass and a thin dark frame, and he brought it back to his office and hung it on the wall behind his desk. Not in a prominent place. Not somewhere designed to be noticed by the people who came to meet with him. In a place where he could see it from his chair. Every day. Every morning when he sat down. Every afternoon when he looked up from whatever he was working on. He did not hang it there as a monument to what he had done. He hung it there as a monument to what she had done. To what it had taken Kathleen Davis to prepare that letter and slip it quietly into his correspondence stack and trust that a man who had never once looked at her properly would do the right thing without even knowing he was doing it. He hung it there so that every morning, before the calls began and the emails piled up and the day became the efficient and forward-moving machine he had always built his days to be, Raymond Smith would look at that letter and remember. Not what he had signed. What it had almost cost her that he had not. Raymond Smith visited his maid's home unannounced. And what he found there was not scandal. It was not a secret that destroyed him. It was not anything loud or explosive or designed to bring a man to his knees. What he found was a mirror, held up by a woman who had been quietly extraordinary in a world that had never once thought to ask. A woman who had carried her life, every heavy, unglamorous, exhausting pound of it, with a dignity so consistent and so private that the people closest to her had mistaken it for simplicity, had mistaken her steadiness for ordinariness, had looked at her every day and seen only what she did and never once stopped to consider who she was. And for the first time in years, for the first time since grief had closed him off from everything that required him to feel rather than function, Raymond Smith looked into that mirror. And he did not look away. That is where the story ends. Not with a dramatic resolution. Not with a ceremony or a headline or a moment designed for an audience. It ends quietly, the way the most important things in life tend to end. In an ordinary room between two ordinary people, with the simple and radical act of one human being finally seeing another. It ends with a framed letter on the wall of an office, with a covered plate left on a kitchen counter, with a teenage girl sleeping through the night for the first time in months, with a woman in a chair by a window, getting stronger one day at a time, in a house where the flower bed out front has been freshly watered and the curtains are perfectly even on both sides. It ends the way real life ends its chapters, not with everything fixed, but with something true finally said. And something true once said changes the shape of everything that comes after it. But here is what stays with me about this story. Here is the part that I cannot set down no matter how many times I come back to it. It is not Raymond's awakening. It is not even Kathleen's courage, extraordinary as it was. It is the sheer, staggering ordinariness of how this almost did not happen at all. Raymond almost did not get in the car that Tuesday evening. He almost talked himself out of it, told himself it was not his responsibility, told himself she would call by morning, told himself that the professional boundary existed for a reason and that crossing it would be inappropriate and unnecessary. He almost left. And if he had started that engine and pulled away from that curb, Kathleen Davis would have recovered or not recovered entirely on her own, in that house without anyone from that penthouse ever knowing. Eva would have gone to college or not gone, would have managed or not managed, and Raymond Smith would have gone on being exactly the man he had always been. Efficient, accomplished, empty. And none of the three of them would have known what they had missed. That is the part that stays with me. How close it came to being a story that was never told. Because nobody knocked on the door. Think about the people in your own life right now. Not the people you are close to, not your family, not your friends, not the people whose lives you are already inside of. Think about the people on the edges. The ones who show up in the background of your days with such reliability that you have stopped registering their presence the way you stop registering the sound of traffic when you live near a busy road. The person who has worked alongside you for years and whose last name you have never learned. The woman who has cleaned your office every Thursday evening for as long as you can remember and whom you have never once greeted by name. The man who has delivered your packages and walked your dog and fixed your plumbing and disappeared back into the fabric of a city that never asked how he was doing. Think about those people. Think about what they might be carrying right now, today, in the hours when they are not in your line of sight. Think about what you do not know about them. Think about what you have never thought to ask. How many people move through our lives carrying something we have never thought to ask about? How many times do we walk past someone's quiet dignity without registering it, without even slowing down enough to notice it is there? Raymond Smith got lucky. He got a second chance that he did not earn and did not deserve and almost did not take. Most people never get it. And what is harder to sit with than that? What is the thought that this story leaves me with every time, is that most people never realize they needed one. We tell ourselves that we are good people. Most of us genuinely believe it. We do not think of ourselves as the kind of person who overlooks others, who reduces people to their function, who moves through life taking the quiet contributions of invisible people entirely for granted. We think of that as something other people do, colder people, more selfish people, people less aware and less conscientious than we are. But Raymond Smith thought that too. Raymond Smith, by the standards of his world, was a decent man. He worked hard. He was fair in his business dealings. He did not mistreat anyone intentionally. And for 7 years he walked past a woman who was slowly being broken by the weight of a life he had made no effort to see. Decency is not the same thing as attention. And attention, real attention, the kind that costs you something, the kind that requires you to slow down and look and ask and actually listen to the answer, is rarer than we think. And more important than almost anything else we could offer the people around us. So before you leave today, I want to ask you something sincerely. Has there ever been someone in your life that you completely overlooked? Someone who showed up for you quietly and consistently while you were looking somewhere else? Someone you took so thoroughly for granted that you only truly saw them. Their courage, their sacrifice, their dignity, their full and specific humanity, when it was almost too late. Or maybe someone you have not yet had your Raymond Smith moment with. Someone who is still there, still showing up, still waiting to be seen. Think about that person right now. Hold them in your mind for a moment, and then tell us about them in the comments below. Because your answer, whatever it is, however long or short, however painful or hopeful, might be the most important thing someone else reads today. Someone who is watching this right now and needed exactly that reminder to pick up the phone, or knock on a door, or simply look up from their own life long enough to say, I see you. I have always seen you. And I am sorry it took me this long to say so. That is what this story is really about. Not a man who visited his maid's home. Not a woman who kept a secret for 11 months. Not even the scholarship letter in the frame on the wall of an office. It is about the distance between two human beings that should never have existed in the first place. And the extraordinary, ordinary, quietly revolutionary act of choosing to close it. Before it is too late. While there is still time. While the door is still there to knock on and someone is still on the other side of it. Alive and real and worthy of being seen. Raymond Smith knocked on that door. And it changed his life. Not because of what was behind it, but because of what he chose to do when he saw it. And that choice, that simple, human, almost did not happen choice, is available to every single one of us. Every day. In the lives of the people who are already around us. Already showing up. Already waiting. We just have to look. If the story moved you today, and I believe it did, please hit that like button before you go. Costs you nothing. Takes 1 second. And it helps us reach someone out there who needed to hear exactly this today and does not yet know it. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this one. Stories that are real and human and do not let you off the hook easily, stories that ask something of you and trust you to rise to it. We tell these stories because they matter, because the people in them matter, and because you watching this right now matter too. We will see you in the next one.